win for both Seoul and Tokyo. President Yoon Suk-yeol rolls up his sleeves to persuade the public the pursuit of softer bilateral ties will boost economic and security cooperation. Chinese President Xi Jinping calls for peace talks over Ukraine in a joint statement with Russian leader Vladimir Putin, who says Ukraine and the West are not ready for it. The two dear friends also signal unity against the U.S. The U.S. CHIPS Act incentives will limit expansion of semiconductor manufacturing capacity in countries of concern by 5%. Not the worst-case scenario for South Korean firms for now. A win for both Seoul and Tokyo. President Yoon Suk-yeol has rolled up his sleeves to persuade the public that pursuit of softer bilateral ties will boost economic and security cooperation. Our top office correspondent Oh Soo-young leads our coverage this morning.
South Korea and Japan's bilateral ties are not a zero-sum game, but a forward-looking partnership rooted in the shared values of liberal democracy, rule of law and the market economy. That's according to President Yoon Suk-yeol on Tuesday, speaking at the first cabinet meeting held after his summit with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida last week. With Yoon's office having welcomed Kishida's invite to the G7 meeting in May, the South Korean president called for deeper reconciliation to forge new win-win relations, remembering history but not being shackled by the past.
날로 치열해지는 미중 전략 경쟁, 글로벌 공급망 위기, 북핵 위협의 고도화 등 우리를 둘러싼 복합 위기 속에서 한일 협력의 필요성은 더욱 커졌기 때문입니다.
Such issues, along with financial vulnerabilities, inflation and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, are among the top agendas for the upcoming G7 summit in Hiroshima. Amid various global challenges, Washington has been pushing Seoul and Tokyo to mend fences after their bilateral ties fell to a critical low in 2019, over Japan's wartime use of forced labor and sexual enslavement of women in Korea before and during World War II. The Yoon administration offered an olive branch earlier this month with a plan to compensate Korean forced labor victims without requiring Japanese firms to make reparations or Tokyo to issue fresh apologies. With growing mood for reconciliation, Yoon and Kishida last week agreed to develop future-oriented relations with economic security dialogues and greater private sector exchanges. However, as Kishida faces 5 parliamentary by-elections next month, bolder moves by Tokyo to boost bilateral ties, especially over historically sensitive issues, may come after the G7 summit on his potential trip to Seoul.
And hopefully, when he's in South Korea, Prime Minister Kishida might feel he's more able to offer something more conciliatory, maybe pressuring the companies Mitsubishi Nippon Steel to make some sort of contribution to the compensation fund that's being set up, which is currently voluntary.
The leaders of South Korea, the US and Japan are likely to hold a summit on the sidelines of the G7 meeting, focusing on ways to increase trilateral cooperation on both security and economy. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
Now, over in the Kremlin, Chinese President Xi Jinping calls for peace talks over Ukraine in a joint statement with Russian leader Vladimir Putin, who says Ukraine and the West are not ready for it. And the two dear friends are also signaling unity against the U.S. Our Lee Sin-ja has more.
After holding informal talks for over 4 hours on Monday, Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin held talks again on Tuesday, this time with their full delegations. And after their meeting on Tuesday, the two leaders signed and released a joint statement at the Kremlin in Moscow, where they called on the need to settle the Ukraine crisis through peace talks. Titled The Joint Statement of the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation on Deepening the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership of Coordination for the New Era, both Xi and Putin stressed that the purposes and principles of the UN Charter must be observed and international law must be followed regarding the Ukraine conflict. Putin praised the Chinese leader's push to bring peace between Ukraine and Russia. However, he accused Kyiv and its Western allies of rejecting it. Xi, meanwhile, barely mentioned the ongoing war in Ukraine. instead apparently trying to remain firm on China's neutral stance. However, some American pundits say China's neutral stance needs to be questioned as Xi's visit to Russia highlights his determination to push back against the U.S. and its Western allies. Meanwhile, President Xi invited President Putin to visit China this year in what some believe is a symbolic show of support after the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Putin. Xi extended the invitation during Tuesday's meeting, inviting Putin to the third Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation, along with Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin. Putin attended the Belt and Road Forum on two previous occasions in 2017 and 2019. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg on Tuesday warned China against providing arms support to Russia. He said that the joint statement issued by the two leaders showed that China and Russia are coming closer, and that any weapon support from China would mean its support for an illegal war.
So first, we haven't seen any proof that China is delivering lethal weapons to Russia. But we have seen some signs that this has been a request from Russia, and that this is an issue that is considered in Beijing.
He added that if China is serious about bringing peace, it also needs to understand Ukraine's stance and communicate directly with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Washington has once again called on all UN member nations to make sure Pyongyang is held accountable for its series of military provocations in recent days. Speaking at a daily press briefing on Tuesday, the U.S. State Department's principal deputy spokesperson Vedant Patel said the North's latest provocation on Monday was especially concerning as the regime simulated the use of a tactical nuclear weapon. Patel stressed the need for international action to hold Pyongyang accountable, especially as China and Russia have used their veto power to block UN Security Council action. His comment comes just a day after the UNSC failed to produce any outcome in a meeting held to discuss measures against Pyongyang's continued provocations. And with Chinese President Xi Jinping visiting Russia, another strategic foreign visit took place on the other side of the Ukraine conflict. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida made a surprise visit to Kyiv on Tuesday for talks with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The PM pledged to deliver $470 million worth of new aid for the energy sector and some $30 million through NATO funds for non-lethal equipment. Also, with Japan set to host the G7 summit in May, the PM invited Zelensky, to which the Ukrainian leader replied he would take part virtually. The visit by Kishida, the last G7 leader to visit Ukraine, comes amid growing domestic pressure to make the trip. Now he becomes Japan's first post-war leader to enter a war zone since World War II. The U.S. CHIPS Act incentives will limit expansion of semiconductor manufacturing capacity in countries of concern by 5%. Now, South Korean firms with production lines in China breathe a sigh of relief as the Act's details are not as strict as some had expected. Our Kim Do-yeon reports.
Semiconductor producers that receive U.S. subsidies will not be able to expand production of advanced chips in countries of concern by more than 5% over the next 10 years. This applies to South Korean companies such as Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix, who have production lines in China. Other countries of concern include Iran, Russia, and North Korea. On Tuesday local time, the U.S. Commerce Department released a notice of proposed rulemaking, and through a statement, U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo said, "The innovation and technology funded in the CHIPS Act is how we plan to expand the technological and national security advantages of America and our allies. These guardrails will help ensure we stay ahead of adversaries for decades to come." The Commerce Department says the limits on expansion is, quote, meant to allow for funding recipients that have existing facilities in a foreign country of concern to continue to operate and maintain their competitiveness by allowing for technological upgrades as long as the cap is met. The rule also limits recipients of incentive funds from engaging in joint research or technology licensing efforts with a foreign entity of concern and prohibits recipients of CHIPS incentives from using the funds in other countries. The proposed regulations allow the U.S. government to claw back the entire funding awarded to any recipient that breaks the Act's rules. South Korean companies had been anxiously waiting on the details of the restrictions as Samsung and SK both announced investment into the U.S. aiming for this subsidy, which could offer each company up to $53 billion through subsidies and tax cuts. However, the announcement was not as strict as expected, and Samsung and SK will be able to receive the subsidy while continuing production in China. With the new announcement, local reports quoted company officials from Samsung saying the company has avoided the worst. Currently, Samsung produces some 40% of its NAND flash chips, and SK Hynix manufacturing about half of its global DRAM chips in China. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
On Monday, South Korea joined many countries around the world to allow the people to have the option of not wearing a mask when taking public transportation. Now, how has the response been, and what measures remain in terms of COVID-19 related rules? For more, we're joined by Dr. David Kwok from Soonchunhyang University. Welcome back to the program.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Good morning. The country confirmed just over 12,000 new COVID-19 cases on the first day, which is Monday, without mandatory mask wearing on public transportation. Now, that figure would obviously not yet reflect the eased mask rule, but how do you expect the infection trend to move going forward?
Well, what I see just recently is that, as you mentioned, the lift of the mandates for the mask does not necessarily show up in its effects right away. But what I've seen in the past 2 months or so, with also gradual lifting of the masking, I've seen that people kept on their mask most of the time, despite walking on the streets, or whether that be, inside a hospital or inside restaurants. When people were just generally taking on their daily activities, they decided to keep their mask on. So I don't think the effects of lifting the mandates have shown to the society yet. But what I see just recently was that I saw a gradual increase in number of people who started to take off their mask, especially on the streets, in the places where they feel safer to do so. And with the lift of the mandates for, keeping the mask on in the public transportation, even though not suddenly, probably more in the sense of gradual, in fashion of gradual, I think people will be starting to take off their mask. In regards to the effects of it, however, also because of its gradualness, I think there will be a gradual increase in the number of daily confirmations also. But I don't think it'll affect in a way that it'll suddenly increase to the number that we did not foresee before. So I anticipate that we'll begin to see more of a fluctuation in a very gradual fashion of increase and decrease in the numbers of confirmation cases.
Certainly. I'll be honest, it took me one full day to not wear my mask.
Well, it's hard for us because it's become a habit for us.
Right, very. And looking back, we've had multiple rounds of COVID-19 infection waves. And the question is, are we done with spikes in infection numbers? I mean, if not, how many more are yet to come? What do you think?
Well, referring back to the sort of gradualness of these measures that are happening, I don't think there will be a sudden spike in the number to come in the future. People, because they have been exposed to the massive numbers before, and they have been quite thoroughly vaccinated, the amount of people who will start to lose their immunity against COVID-19 would sort of differ for different age groups, different situations, different backgrounds of medical entities. So I think, as I said before, now in the future, I think it'll be more likely that we'll start to see gradual fluctuations rather than sudden spikes and sudden drops in the numbers. So if you ask me a question to foresee how many more spikes we would see in the future, I don't think we'll see any spikes, but it's more likely that we'll see gradual uphill and downhills of the numbers.
Right, multiple ups and downs in the number of infections to come rather than spikes in the infection numbers. All right.
Probably.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Kwak, for your insights again this morning.
Thanks for having me.
On the back of K-culture enjoying much love globally, the Culture Ministry has published a book introducing traditional Korean liquor, including Gamhongno. Our Shin-Se-byuk takes us on a journey to discover this unique beverage.
Sweet, red dough. That's what this Korean traditional liquor Gamhongno literally means. This liquor, with its deep, gentle aroma, was considered one of the 3 best liquors of the Joseon dynasty. Amid increased global popularity of Korean culture, the Culture Ministry has published a book that introduces various traditional alcoholic beverages, and Kamungno was one of them. Although it may not be as popular as other drinks such as makgeolli, Kamungno has long been considered a medicinal liquor that warms the body. Today, Kamungno is brewed in Paju, Gyeonggi-do Province by Korea's Grandmaster No. 43 Lee Ki-suk. He is the only person in Korea who can make the liquor using the traditional recipe that's been passed down through generations of her family. Making Kamungno is all about waiting and patience. First, she mixes rice, millet, and the Korean fermentation starter duruk and lets the mixture sit and ripen for 15 days. Even the slightest change in temperature at this step can make a huge difference in taste later on. For the next 4 months, she distills it twice to get this crystal clear, 40% strength fine soju. However, it is only halfway there. She then adds 7 medicinal herbs, including ginger and cinnamon, before letting it sit for 3 more months. After that, she removes the solids from the liquid and lets the drink rest for 1 more year. And here marks the end of the 1.5-year journey of this red-colored dough that satisfies the senses of sight, smell, and taste. He says her goal is to continue to pass down the family legacy, keeping Korea's traditional drinks culture alive for future generations.
Kamungno began as a part of my father's and my grandmother's everyday life. Now it has become a part of Korean culture over time. I want to pass down not only the recipe, but also the spirit to our future generations.
She also says with Korean traditional alcoholic drinks becoming a candidate representing South Korea as its next culture ambassador, Kamungno could warm people's hearts.
Kamungno is a liquor of warmth. I hope that it can serve as a symbol of Korean warmth and hospitality. In that way, I believe this could potentially contribute to the spread of Korean culture.
Shin-Se-byuk, Arirang News.
For a look at the news from around the world, we now turn to our Matthew Ashley joining us here in the studio. Good morning, Matthew.
Good morning, Dami.
Let's start in Haiti this morning. The UN has reported on the devastating impact of gang violence in the country.
Well, that's right. According to a UN report on Tuesday, at least 530 people have died this year alone in Haiti as a result of increasing gang-related violence. Now, this is on top of 277 recorded kidnappings and 300 people left injured in attacks which have mostly taken place in the capital, Port-au-Prince. Now, the UN says the majority of casualties were killed or injured in sniper-like, seemingly indiscriminate shootings. In a bid to mitigate the situation, the UN has called for foreign intervention in the form of a specialized support force. And with US President Joe Biden set to address the issue while meeting the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in Ottawa on Thursday, the UN will be hoping that Biden can convince Trudeau to send a security intervention team to stabilize the Caribbean country. Turning over to Uganda now, where Parliament passed a new law on Tuesday that brings back the death penalty and life sentences for homosexuality. Called the Anti-Homosexuality Bill, the law would give the death penalty for so-called aggravated homosexuality and life in prison if caught having gay sex. It marks an even stricter crackdown on the LGBTQ community in a country that has already banned homosexuality. The new law also introduces a 10-year prison sentence for merely identifying as LGBTQ or engaging in same-sex related activities. Such activities include promoting and abetting homosexuality. Supporters of the law say it's necessary to preserve traditional values, but human rights activists say that it violates multiple fundamental rights. Meanwhile, a major review into London's Metropolitan Police has accused it of being institutionally racist, sexist and homophobic. This is according to a 363-page report released on Tuesday, which followed a year-long review. The report alleges that the Met failed to protect both members of the public and female staff. It included stories of sexual assaults, many of which were covered up, and instances where evidence from rape cases were not properly stored. The report comes as public trust in Britain's biggest force has collapsed in the wake of a number of scandals, including a case where a police officer raped and murdered a woman. The report also included instances of racism and bullying among Met police officers.
Good morning. If you liked yesterday's warms, you will like today's late May-like temperatures even more. Afternoon highs will be 12 degrees higher than seasonal norms today, even warmer than Daegu in Seoul this afternoon, rising to 24 degrees. And it's very likely many central parts of the country will have record-breaking warms this afternoon. But sadly, the ultrafine dust level will stay high in the capital region in Chungcheong-Namdo province again. So please have a face mask that can filter out dust. Mostly sunny skies will turn cloudy with rain in the forecast on Jeju this morning, gradually spreading to southern provinces late this afternoon before expanding to the capital region tonight. And this round of rain is forecast to continue into tomorrow afternoon, which will help to ease the dryness in the air. Morning temperatures are 1 to 5 degrees higher than the same time yesterday, and southern provinces will have highs that are a couple of degrees lower with rain in the forecast. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
That wraps up today's New Day at Arirang. Do stay with us for more updates throughout the day. Thanks for watching.
부산 항해 그리운 내 형제여. 어쩌다 마주친 그대 모습에 내 마음을 빼앗겨 버렸네. 어쩌다 마주친 그대 두 눈이 내 마음을 쏟아버 버렸네. 그대에게 할 말이 있는데 왜 이리 참으로 놀러와 진짜는 우리가 돌아와 조금씩 너희가 있는 곳에 이제 서서히 올라가. 거기 가자 거기 있어봤자 진짜는 보여줄게 우리가 거기 닿자마자. 세상 일상 너무 내들 괴상 너희가 최고라니 그건 너무 환상. Come back home see me tapping your yo.
Bringing you the first news of the day. I'm Kim Dami for New Day at Arirang.
A new approach to current affairs for millennials and Gen Z. I'm Yoon, the news anchor for News Generation.
Accurate coverage of the latest domestic and global issues. I'm Arirang news anchor, Gamhongno.
Busan, Korea is already reaching the entire world, like ocean waves that travel far and wide. It's Busan, the perfect World Expo city, transforming our world, navigating toward a better future.
What matters?
K-animation, loved and watched around the world. We want to make more animations to reach more children. Traveling time and space. Developing adventure and curiosity. Infinite creativity and hope. We want our children to grow up to be happy. K-animation, watched by children all around the world. So that joy can be felt when our animation is watched. This is the reason we make animation and share with the world. K-animation, befriending children all over the world.
참으로 놀러와 진짜는 우리가 돌아와 조금씩 너희가 있는 곳에 이제 서서히 올라가. 거기 가자 거기 있어봤자 진짜는 보여줄게 우리가 거기 닿자마자. 세상 일상 너무 내들 괴상 너희가 최고라니 그건 너무 환상. Come back home see me tapping your yo.
do some the Kamza song?
No, please. We're here to make a new type of news.
New insights, new styles, and new topics every day.
We are News Generation. Making news just for you. It's March 22nd here in Seoul. I'm Yoon, and this is News Generation, where we make the news at Arirang's very own open studio. Every morning, we'll discuss the top issues and latest current affairs affecting people in their 20s and 30s. Joining me in the studio is Kim Xiang.
Good morning, yeah.
And Nao Song. Hi, everyone. Both are here to speak on behalf of those in their 20s and 30s. Now, we'll first start with our news feed. Let's take a look at the top trending hashtags and news items that have shaken up social media over the past 24 hours. The first hashtag for your news feed of the day is 불구리. 불구리 is a special ramyeon snack that one of BTS's members, Jungkook, shared with fans. It's a combination of 불닭 spicy chicken noodles and noguri ramen, and the maker of noguri ramen, Nongshim, was quick enough to register this name as a trademark with the Korean Intellectual Property Office. Nongshim explained this was to prevent any other company from commercializing their noguri ramen, and added that it was very unlikely that 불구리 would be made into an actual product because that would require a collab with Samyang Food. But some fans criticized Nongshim, saying that if anyone were to own the trademark, it should have been Jungkook. The second hashtag is UNSC. The UN Security Council has failed yet again to adopt a resolution on North Korea's latest ICBM launch. The meeting was held Monday local time as countries like South Korea, the US, and Japan condemned Pyongyang's provocations. China and Russia, on the other hand, blamed South Korea-US military drills for the North's actions. The last hashtag is no mask. From this Monday, people in Korea were allowed to take off their face masks on public transport as part of the government's efforts to ease COVID-19 regulations. But as many local media outlets and social media users pointed out, hardly anybody took their masks off inside subways and buses, and most said that it was because they were so used to wearing masks for the past 2.5 years, and partly because of the fine dust in the air this week. Now let's expand the news feed to the studio. I would like to hear what our young panelists have to say about the second hashtag, UNSC. So now, what do you think about the UNSC's continuous failure, I guess, to bring North Korea out to the table? And as a millennial, how frequently do you search up North Korea?
Well, this doesn't seem very surprising or like it's news because it's been on repeat like a broken record, and the resolution isn't effective, obviously, and it doesn't seem to change much. And to be completely honest, this is why I don't really look up political and diplomatic issues on North Korea, because, you know, it doesn't really change much over the times. But, you know, I've always been fascinated with the country of North Korea as the country, the culture, and the linguistical differences that we have from the North and South. And I think that's how a lot of younger generation are. They're more interested in North Korea as a country and their culture.
Definitely. And just an update for our viewers as to how much of a nuclear threat North Korea has been to the global community. Just a few days ago, North Korea fired yet another short-range ballistic missile toward the East Sea, and this came just a week after the North fired a Hwasong-17 ICBM. So Xiang, apart from its nuclear threat, what are some issues Pyongyang brings up for the international community, and are there any that caught your attention?
Yeah, I mean, just before I go into that, I would like to quickly mention about the UNSC resolution and the failure of it. I mean, the main problem is that, you know, it's not just about the Western countries. It has a diverse range of interests. You know, Russia and China also have veto as well. So that often, you know, blockades the actual resolution from going forward.
Definitely.
You know, we've got to think about the whole, you know, geopolitical tension rather than just what we believe as sort of, you know, Western allies as well.
Yeah.
And now moving on to the points about Pyongyang, other than nuclear, you know, plans and to missile launches, testing and everything, North Korea has been criticized by the international community for, you know, decades for its human rights abuses, including forced labor, political repression, and restrictions of freedom of speech, assembly, and religion. The country's government has been accused of widespread human rights violation, including torture, you know, public executions, imprisonment of political dissidents, foreign journalists as well, and other individuals who are deemed a threat to the regime. Additionally, North Korea has been accused of engaging in cyber attacks internationally, counterfeiting, and other illicit activities to fund its nuclear program and evade international sanctions. These issues have been the subject of international condemnation and sanctions for the past many years, as we've seen recently as well with the most recent UNSC assembly. as well as efforts to engage with North Korea to address its human rights record and other concerns.
And I think a lot of us in the younger generation are really fixated on the human rights violations that the North has been continuously showing. But we've also been seeing regular provocations from Pyongyang. Meanwhile, the country still suffers from critical humanitarian issues, like Xiong mentioned, like starvation. And this requires attention and help of the international community. So we've prepared a very similar topic for you. Take a look at the screen.
Just 3 months into the new year, North Korea has not just once or twice, but again and again broken the UN Security Council resolutions. This matched experts' concerns that the North would continue its major provocations from last year. In 2022, Pyongyang fired a total of 68 missiles, including 8 ICBMs. The North is launching rocket after rocket, despite people there being on the brink of starvation. News outlets reported that Pyongyang has even prepared cutting food rationing to soldiers and starving inmates at prisons due to deepening food shortages across the country. The United Nations and South Korean authorities cited satellite images and trade data to suggest that the North's food supply has dropped below the minimum amount to satisfy human needs and will therefore lead to a jump in deaths. They also analyzed this to be from 3 years of closed borders and self-isolation due to the pandemic. Even before the COVID-19 outbreak, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization found nearly half of the North Korean population to be undernourished. Today, NewsGen aims to answer 3 questions. 1. While Pyongyang might have only itself to blame for its food shortage problem, should people there have to suffer and starve? What are millennials and Gen Z saying about this? 2. Should South Korea prioritize helping its brother country North Korea with its humanitarian crisis, despite ongoing provocations and war? 3. How do millennials, Gen Z, and Korea feel about the North Korean regime and North Koreans respectively?
As we just saw, North Korea is suffering with the most severe food insecurity crisis since its famine in the 90s. And the North's economy has been withering as the regime chose to self-isolate itself during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is why the international community is still finding ways to help the reclusive state despite ongoing nuclear missile threats. So here in the studio, what do you guys think about the core of North Korea's humanitarian crisis, which is a lack of food? And do you think countries like South Korea should at least help the people in the North by providing food?
Yeah, I mean, to an extent, yes. You know, humanitarian aid, especially food aid, I think is a reasonable measure to be given from South Korea to North Korea. I mean, South Korea, especially last year, had a surplus of rice production. And I think things like that could be definitely made to good use by sending it to the North Korean brothers, I guess, in the sense. For now. As well as according to the Rural Development Administration, North Korea's food crop production was estimated at only about 4.51 million tons. This figure is 180,000 tons less from 2021 due to bad weather and lack of fertilizers. North Korea launched at least 70 missiles last year. The cost estimated around $200 million, which can buy up to 500,000 tons of rice that can be eaten for 46 days by the entire North Korean population. And that can also cover more than 60% of the food shortage expected for this year.
Right, so it makes you think about the priorities the North is trying to put. And now, what do you think? Should countries like South Korea at least try to help the people there?
Yeah, and of course, humanitarian aid is always needed. However, like we've been talking about, there are some concerns with, helping North Korea in this aspect. While Xiong mentioned that a lot of these funds are delivered through NGOs, it's, very not common to see the follow-up of where these go, if it actually goes to the people that need them. And I think there's just no guarantee because of how closed off the country is. And, as we've been seeing, they've been wasting a lot of money on, different types of weapons. So there's that concern of just helping them with that.
So even in the studio, it seems you guys have different thoughts on whether we should really be helping North Korea out, considering their provocations. So what about other millennials and Gen Z? Is there continued hostility towards North Korea as we've seen in the older generation?
Yes, I mean, interestingly, the South Korean millennials and Gen Z seem to have different opinions towards the countries they feel hostile towards compared to the older generation. Previously, the majority of hostility remained towards Japan for the colonization period, as well as North Korea for the physical threats of war. However, looking at a 2021 survey sponsored by 국민일보, which with a sample size of 1,000 Koreans aged 18 to 39, the results seems to have varied. Let's have a look at the screen. Overall, a distinct majority of 51.7% of young Koreans chose China as their least favorite country, followed by Japan at 31.2%, whilst North Korea only made up 12.6%. This negative perception towards China becomes even more highlighted when looking at the data for the Generation Zs aged between 18 and 24. Over 60% of all Gen Zs responded that they dislike China the most, followed by Japan at around 23%, and North Korea, surprisingly, only at 10.7%. I believe the recent unfair economic and geopolitical provocations by the Chinese towards South Korea and its industries and companies seems to have exacerbated this negativity at a surprising figure at almost 6 times more than the imminent threat of war with our northern neighbor.
So it seems compared to the older generation, our new generation doesn't really have that much hostility towards North Korea. But what do most of them think about assisting North Korea even when we're still technically at war?
You know, many of the younger generation are quite indifferent about the issue of North Korea in general. And like we mentioned, the older generation had this war that they experienced on a personal level, and they did also get the education of unification is our biggest wish kind of thing. The younger generation of Koreans don't really have that emotional tie of brotherhood with them. They consider North Korea to be from the same root but a completely different country. So I think the other nations that do need humanitarian aid, the millennials and Gen Z, are open to going out there and helping, but that emotional bond, the brotherly bond to prioritize North Korea over other nations is just not there.
That brotherly bond and prioritization, I think that's a very fascinating point now. So do you think we should prioritize helping North Korea over other countries, especially with, like, as you mentioned, we have brother countries like Turkey, for instance, and they've recently been struck with like major earthquakes. What do you think about this?
I mean, I think diplomatic dynamics are very important, and which each nation should be considered on its own, but Turkey has actually shared a long history of brotherhood with South Korea, and ironically fighting against North Korea with the South Koreans in the Korean War. As tensions have been rising with the missile launches recently, I believe that many younger South Koreans are feeling a little less keen on sending aid towards North Korea. And like I mentioned, I think to know North Korea, you need to understand the people, but there's just no connection there for people to have that emotional bond that we were talking about.
Right, and Xiong, I'd like to ask you the same question. Should we help Pyongyang because of our geopolitical or historical ties? And from a diplomatic perspective, how would this benefit South Korea?
Yeah, I mean, this year, 2023, actually marks the 70th year since the peace truce, not an end of war, but truce signed with North Korea. I mean, there has been a tight geopolitical tension throughout the 70 years as well, with imminent threats of war happening at our doorsteps, with the older generation experiencing things like, you know, war alarms and every now and then, with the occasional sort of trainings in preparation for war as well. Helping Pyongyang definitely, for that reason, inevitably had political implications all the time. You know, sending multi-food aid, humanitarian aid also implied wish for a bilateral or multilateral meeting, summit meetings that sometimes have been successful in the past. Funnily enough, pre-2000s, Japan was the major export destination of North Korea. However, from 2010, China became virtually the only export destination, at around 80% of all goods and services produced in North Korea going directly to the Chinese markets. And I mean, thinking about the geopolitical tension, I think is important to mention here. With the recent provocations from Russia as well in Ukraine, and China becoming a larger player in the region, and countries like Japan and South Korea historically being a US ally, there's huge amount of tension that's been going on. And North Korea definitely has a historical legacy with the Chinese Communist Party as well. And I think those are the things we should be thinking about in terms of diplomatic relations. It's more complex than we would actually be able to think. And I mean, so in that sense, I think humanitarian aid is a viable option. But in the mention of diplomatic tensions and things like that, geopolitical tensions, I think we should give it time and figure out our stance and see how the regime acts as well.
They should be tackled separately, right?
Yes.
All right. So let's now use this time to hear from a North Korean defector and find out just how severe food insecurity is there, and also find out what North Koreans think of foreign aid, especially when it comes from their neighbor, South Korea. We're now going to be hearing from a North Korean defector and find out how bad the food shortage problem is there. It's Pagani, who's also a human rights advocate. Uni, it's actually our second time having you on the show. Great to have you back.
Thank you for having me again.
All right, Uni, I'd like to ask you the first question. You defected to South Korea back in 2012, and while you were still in North Korea, did you experience or witness starvation or severe hunger? How bad is the food insecurity crisis in North Korea?
I can obviously say that as current food crisis of North Korea is extremely serious, that the severity of the situation is evidenced that by the noticeable weight loss of Kim Jong-un nowadays, which some analysts interpret as a sign of the dire food situations in the country. It's believed that this previous corpulence had become a political liability, leading him to lose weight intentionally. Because I vividly remember when I was in North Korea, while I was watching North Korean news with my family members, my dad obviously said, just certainly said that if our leader sacrificed for our people without eating proper meal, proper sleep, why he looks like a pig? That's perspective of North Koreans towards the leader of North Korea. So when I was in North Korea, I obviously witnessed that many people died on the streets due to hunger. There were frequent heavy rains that would wash away the many houses. That can people face food crisis and financial difficulties. And even my friends in elementary school had to help their mothers with economy activities. Instead of going to school to study, they are only 8 or 9 years old.
Yes, I guess the Great Flood of 1995, which started the South Korean humanitarian aid to North Korea, is something that you've been mentioning with the heavy rains as well. But Unia, here's a question that represents some of the concerns of the younger generation, like me and Niall mentioned earlier. Do food supplies or other goods from foreign aid actually reach to the people of North Korea?
I can say there is probability, because when I was in orphanage, I and other orphans were received snacks and supplies from UN. So when I was young and when I was in orphanage, we think about the UN as like our hero that could help us to survive in that country. So there is probability, but I can say that the effectiveness of the human aid to residents in North Korea cannot be fully operated because of the North Korean government's opaque political systems and a lot of corruptions there. So we have to make sure that we have to ensure that this human aid can be reached out to residents in North Korea who need it most.
Yeah, and you just mentioned the effectiveness of it. So what would be the most appropriate and effective way to help North Korea and people in North Korea?
To be honest, it would be great if we reach out the bottom of people who need it most. However, because of the North Korean, the political situations with other countries cannot be fully, as I mentioned before. So I don't know which is the best and effective way. But when we negotiate with the North Korean government, we have to make sure that their efforts should be made to ensure that North Korean people can get that receive humanitarian aid from the international organizations.
And currently, a lot of non-governmental international organizations like the WFP or the WHO are helping North Korea. But let's see if we can better the ways that it actually reaches the residents.
Thank you very much, Uni.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
All right. Now, any points that fascinated you two in the studio among Uni's comments?
Yeah, I mean, as you've just mentioned as well, the WFP, UNICEF, and WHO are the three main international organizations that sends foreign aid, humanitarian aid to North Korean people. I was actually surprised from Uni, her childhood experience of actually receiving the UN supplies and having been fed even at an orphanage as well with those supplies. So I guess to an extent, a lot of, most of the actual goods would reach the people that are in need as well.
Definitely. And Niall?
Yeah, I mean, I think just hearing her personal experience makes me connect with her and connect with people of North Korea on a more human level. And yeah, I was actually also surprised to hear that this is actually going towards the people in North Korea. So my heart has been opened a little bit more towards that.
That's good. Your horizons have been opened.
Yeah.
And all right, let's now hear from our viewers on what they have to say about our discussion topic of the day. So we asked them whether we should provide humanitarian aid, and here's what they had to say. So Cyrus John said, we're talking about the people of North Korea who need our help. It's better to send them food supplies than money. Ho Sang-che says, as a South Korean, if North Korea doesn't shoot some ballistic missiles, I can help them. And Tiras Bell says, I think that the Unification Ministry should continue to extend this olive branch as a good gesture. That peace is always on the table. Now, Xiong, very briefly, which comment fascinated you?
I mean, Cyrus John, I think definitely I could relate to. Sending money will definitely go directly towards the weapons program.
Right.
Any cash support goes to, I mean, back a few years back, I think the cash support the North Koreans received, and the first thing Kim Jong-un did was buy a white horse. Really expensive breed as well.
Oh.
And that got a lot of criticism from the international community as well. So I think it makes more sense to give in humanitarian aid terms actual goods rather than actual funds and assets that could be used for other purposes.
And I think our generation is really fixated on where this money and assistance goes, right? So I would now like to end our discussion off by leaving our final thoughts on what we'd like to see regarding the two Koreas' relations and where assistance goes with Niall.
I truly hope that we have a better relationship in the future with North Korea, that it would be more conversational than just passive-aggressive things that just get nowhere. And while political gestures are important and necessary, the critical thing is, like we talked with Uni today, that we connect with North Koreans and North Korea on a human level, get to know them without any censorship. And North Koreans need to do the same with South Korea, get to know each other. And I think that's when, the heart starts to open.
Any thoughts you'd like to add on to that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely transparency is the most important thing in giving humanitarian aid, even regardless of where it's being given. North Korea is definitely a good case. But I think the third generation Kim regime of North Korea is becoming more and more unstable at this point. An increasing majority of North Koreans now have access to the internet partially. People especially who trade with China along the borders. So they are aware of what's going on in the Western world as well as the living standards in South Korea. And I think it might be a good cause if the North Koreans themselves can have some sort of revolution or come together under a civil action and try to actually overthrow the communist dictatorship, if I say. And I think that may be the most peaceful way of reunification for the two Koreas and avoiding the cost of, the dire cost of actual physical warfare.
You're definitely not alone on that. A lot of the millennials and Gen Z here are thinking of ways to help and rescue the people of North Korea. All right, and we'll be here every day from 9:30 a.m. to 10 a.m. Korea time, bringing you the topics that young people are talking about. Special thanks to Kim Xiang.
My pleasure, Ian.
And Niall Song. No problem. Thank you everyone for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. We are New Generation.
춥지 않은가요? 처음 태어난 이별에서
every view.